I still remember the exact words. "You'll never amount to anything." They didn't whisper it. They didn't soften it. They spat it like venom, a chorus of voices that carried the weight of every failure they claimed I had stacked on my shoulders. And the worst part, it wasn't strangers. It was my family, my own blood. You'd think family would be your safe place, the ones who stand by you when the world turns its back. But mine sharpened their knives on my dreams and called it tough love. It started small. At first, it was the comments at the dinner table, the comparisons, the little jabs. My brother, Daniel, the golden child, the chosen one, the one who could do no wrong, would sit at the head of the conversation while I was treated like background noise. "Oh, Daniel just got promoted at work. Oh, Daniel's boss invited him to the governor's banquet. Oh, Daniel is really going places." And then, the subtle dagger aimed at me. "What about you? Still figuring things out?" They said it with fake smiles, but I could feel the disappointment radiating through every syllable. I wasn't like him. I didn't follow the straight path they wanted. I wasn't loud about my achievements, and I certainly wasn't bragging about every little step I took. But here's the thing they never understood. Silence isn't failure. Sometimes silence is strategy. I bit my tongue and listened. I let them think I was behind, that I was lost. Because the more they underestimated me, the stronger my resolve became. But back then, sitting at that dinner table, I didn't feel strong. I felt small, invisible. And when my mother leaned across the table one night, her voice heavy with disdain, and said, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" I swear, a part of me cracked. That was the night I stopped looking at them for approval. That was the night I chose my own path. I worked in silence. I studied when they thought I was sleeping. I networked while they thought I was wasting my time. I built alliances in places they would never bother to look. I learned how politics worked, not from the sidelines, but from the inside. And while they laughed at me, while they rolled their eyes, while they painted me as the family failure, I was preparing. Still, back then, the sting of their rejection burned deeper than I can explain. There was this one moment, it's carved into my memory like stone. My father had just finished praising Daniel for landing a job as the aide to a powerful governor. Everyone clapped. My mother's eyes sparkled with pride. Daniel puffed out his chest like a peacock. And then my aunt. I wanted to scream, to tell them everything, to remind them that slow progress is still progress. But I swallowed it. I kept my dignity and my silence. That was my revenge, because in that silence, I carried a secret that one day would bring them to their knees. That secret was this: I was no failure. I was already on a path bigger than any of them could imagine. I was walking straight toward power, but in that moment, they didn't know, and I didn't tell them. Instead, I watched. I studied their faces, memorized their smirks, their dismissive glances, their careless laughter, because I knew one day, when the truth came out, those same faces would be frozen in shock. And oh, how I lived for that moment. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, whispering to myself, One day they'll see." But before that day came, I had to endure years of their mockery. There was the time Daniel's boss, the governor himself, hosted a grand banquet. Daniel bragged for weeks about being invited, about rubbing shoulders with the state's most powerful leaders. He lorded it over me like a crown. "You wouldn't understand," he said once, smirking as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. "Politics isn't your thing. It's a serious world. Not for dreamers. Not for dreamers." The words stabbed me, but I smiled. Because little did he know I was already inside that world, moving pieces he couldn't even see. But of course, to my family, I was invisible, and sometimes invisibility is the greatest weapon of all, because when the time comes to step into the light, the shock is brighter, and the night of reckoning, oh, it was closer than they thought. I still hear Daniel's voice, bragging as he left for that banquet. One day, I'll be at the top. He didn't know his top would soon look very small standing next to me, because my day, the day I would stop being invisible, was about to arrive, and it would begin with a single sentence, a sentence that would silence the room, drop jewels, and make every smirk vanish. You're the senator. They thought I was drifting. That's the word my uncle used once, drifting. He said it with a pitying shake of his head at a family barbecue, the smell of grilled meat in the air, his glass of wine tilted like he was delivering some grand judgment. Daniel is anchored, he said proudly, clapping my brother on the back. Solid career, a governor's aide, a bright future. And you? He looked at me, his lips curling into a half smile. You're still drifting. I smiled politely, but inside, I was on fire, drifting. No, I was moving in silence, quietly, strategically, one calculated step at a time. Because while they were laughing at me, I was filling out scholarship forms. I was applying for programs they didn't even know existed. I was reading law books until my eyes burned, interning in political offices no one in my family even cared to ask about. I remember my nights in that tiny apartment, barely enough space for a bed, a desk, and stacks of books piled so high I had to squeeze between them to reach the window. I lived on instant noodles and black coffee, my rent always a week late, my clothes thrifted and worn thin, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been, and my dream burned like a star in the dark. Every insult they threw at me became fuel. Every smirk from Daniel became a challenge. Every failure label became a stepping stone. I studied public policy when they thought I was asleep. I networked with aides, with council members, with anyone willing to give me 10 minutes of their time. I learned how deals were made in whispered corners, how votes were swayed not with speeches but with promises. I learned the language of power, and slowly, very slowly, I climbed. There was this one woman, Senator Margaret Hayes. She was older, sharp as a blade, with eyes that saw straight through you. I first met her at a volunteer event. I was just another face, handing out flyers, but she noticed me. She asked me a question about education policy, and I answered not with hesitation, but with conviction. She raised an eyebrow, smiled faintly, and said, "You're not just here for the free pizza, are you?" That was the start of something. She became my mentor. She taught me what no book could. She told me the truths no professor dared to say out loud. Politics is theater, she said once. But behind the curtain, that's where the real power lies. Learn the curtain, and you'll never be powerless again. I held on to those words like scripture. Meanwhile, my family kept living in their bubble. Daniel rose higher under the governor, wearing his tailored suits, posting photos of himself shaking hands with donors, bragging about policy meetings he barely understood, and me. I was sitting in smaller rooms, quieter rooms, rooms that didn't look glamorous on the outside but inside, the decisions being made would ripple across the state. Those were the rooms that mattered. And while my family never noticed, the people in those rooms did. I became known for my work ethic, for my focus, for my refusal to break, no matter how heavy the load. I learned how to argue without raising my voice, how to win a battle without drawing blood, and slowly, doors began to open. First, it was small campaign assistant roles, speech drafting, late-night strategy sessions. Then, bigger policy advisory committees, city council projects, grassroots campaigns. Each role, each handshake, each sleepless night was another brick in the foundation I was building, a foundation no one in my family could see, but I could. I remember walking into the State House for the first time as an aide myself. I wore my cheapest black blazer, my shoes scuffed, my hair tied back, because I couldn't afford a salon. But when I stepped through those doors, I felt taller than I ever had in my life. I belonged, and for the first time, I didn't just whisper it to myself. I believed it. Meanwhile, at family dinners, nothing changed. Daniel still bragged. My parents still beamed at him. My relatives still asked me, "So what are you doing now?" With that same condescending smile. I let them laugh, because I knew something they didn't. I was already moving faster than Daniel ever could. He had one governor to lean on. I had an entire network growing around me. And when the moment came to step forward, I wouldn't just be an aide. I wouldn't just be a name on the roster. I would be the one holding the pen, the one writing the laws, the one with the title they never thought I'd earn. But the road to get there wasn't smooth. I faced nights of doubt so heavy I thought they'd crush me. I faced losses, campaigns that failed, mentors who moved on, promises that fell through. I faced people who underestimated me because of my gender, because of my background, because I didn't look like what they expected. And every time, I wanted to quit. But then, I'd hear my mother's voice. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" And I'd push harder. Every rejection was a reminder. Every failure was fuel. Until the day I didn't need fuel anymore. Because I had become the fire. It was years of sweat, of sacrifice, of silence, but finally, one moment arrived, the election. Not just volunteering, not just assisting, not just advising, running my own name on the ballot. I can still remember the night I announced. The air was electric, my hands shaking as I stood before a modest crowd of supporters in a community center with creaky floors and peeling paint. My voice trembled at first, but as I spoke, it grew steadier. I talked about change, about fairness, about the people left behind while politicians played games. I didn't just give a speech. I gave them my truth, and they listened. That was the night I stopped being invisible. But my family, they didn't know. They didn't care to know. Daniel laughed when he heard a senator. He scoffed. "You don't be ridiculous. Ridiculous." That was his favorite word for me, and yet, months later, when the votes were counted, when the results flashed across the screen, when my name carried more weight than his ever would, I wasn't ridiculous anymore. I was powerful. But the sweetest part wasn't winning. The sweetest part was knowing my family had no idea, not yet. And when the moment of revelation finally came, when the governor himself looked at me across the table and said those words, "You're the senator," their world shattered. But that moment is still ahead in this story. For now, I'll take you back to the climb, because every victory has scars behind it. And mine were carved deep. Running for office wasn't a dream. It was survival. By the time I put my name on the ballot, I wasn't doing it to prove my family wrong. I was doing it to prove myself right. To prove that every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every time I swallowed my pride instead of answering back, it all had meaning. But make no mistake, politics is brutal. and no one expected me to survive it. I was young. I was a woman. I didn't come from money or legacy or some famous family name. My opponents did. They had donors lined up before they even announced. They had machines behind them, well-oiled, ready to crush anyone who stood in their way. And me, I had a handful of volunteers, a campaign office that doubled as a borrowed storage room, and a budget so thin I joked that our slogan should be, "Change you can afford because we can't." But what I lacked in money, I had in fire. I walked every block. I shook every hand. I knocked on doors until my knuckles ached and my voice cracked. I listened not just to what people said, but to what they didn't say. The exhaustion in their eyes. The quiet despair of being invisible. Because I knew what it felt like to be invisible. And maybe that's why they trusted me. But trust alone doesn't win elections. There were days when donations dried up, when our flyers printed wrong, when half my team quit because they thought it was hopeless. There were nights when I sat in my car after a rally with only 12 people in folding chairs and cried so hard my chest hurt. I thought about quitting 100 times, and every time Daniel's voice echoed in my head. "Don't be ridiculous." I clenched the steering wheel and whispered back, "Watch me." Still, the betrayals cut deep. There was one man, a local business owner, who promised his support. He looked me in the eye, shook my hand, swore he'd fund part of my campaign. I built plans around his word. And then, 2 weeks later, he appeared at a fundraiser for my opponent, smiling for the cameras. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call him out, to drag his name through the mud. But I didn't. I learned fast. Politics isn't about reacting. It's about redirecting. Daughters I redirected. Instead of begging donors, I turned to the people. We ran community events, small, humble but real. Pancake breakfasts, park clean-ups. I showed up in living rooms, in church basements, at school board meetings. I didn't come with polished speeches, I came with open ears. And word spread. Slowly, very slowly, people began to believe. But just when momentum built, the smear campaigns began. They called me inexperienced. They dug up every stumble, every job I'd quit, every moment of my past that looked like weakness. They plastered headlines that said unqualified. They whispered that I was just a girl playing politician. It hurt. God, it hurt. But then, one night, at a tiny town hall, an older woman stood up. Her hands shook as she leaned on her cane, but her voice was steady. "They say you're not qualified," she said. "But when I look at you, I see someone who's lived through what we've lived through. That's qualification enough." The crowd clapped. I cried, not in front of them but later, alone. Because in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't running just for me. I was running for everyone who had been dismissed, overlooked, laughed at, everyone who had ever been told, "Why can't you be more like your brother?" Still, the fight wasn't over. Election night came like a storm. I remember the tension in the air, the way my team huddled in that cramped office, eyes glued to the flickering screen. The numbers rolled in county by county. At first, I was losing badly. Daniel texted me halfway through the night. "Still ridiculous," he wrote, followed by a laughing emoji. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall, but I didn't. I stared at the screen, at the widening gap, and whispered to myself, "It's not over. Not yet." And then something happened. The rural districts reported. Places no one expected me to win. Places my opponent never bothered to visit because he thought they didn't matter. But I had visited. I had walked their dirt roads, sat in their diners, listened to their stories, and they remembered. The votes flipped, slowly at first, then faster. My lead grew, and when the final numbers came in, when the ticker at the bottom of the screen changed, when my name was followed by the word winner, I couldn't breathe. I had done it, against all odds, against money, against legacy, against the voices that told me I wasn't enough. I had won, and that victory? It wasn't just political, it was personal, because at that exact moment, my phone buzzed again. Daniel.no laughing emoji this time. Just 3 words. You actually won, actually. As if it was still some kind of accident. I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Winning the election made me a senator on paper. But the true victory? That would come later. The night my family finally saw me for who I was. The night the governor himself looked me in the eyes and said, "You're the senator." That was the moment I lived for. But for now, I sat in that cramped office, surrounded by cheap pizza boxes and exhausted volunteers, tears streaming down my face as the reality sank in. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was unstoppable. The title, senator, didn't feel real at first. It was just a word, printed on paper, etched onto plaques, whispered with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. For weeks, I'd catch myself glancing at the office door where my nameplate gleamed. Senator, last name, my title. But instead of pride, I felt pressure. Walking into my new office that first day, I expected triumph. Instead, I found a stack of folders taller than my desk, a dozen phone calls waiting, and a staff that looked at me like they weren't sure if I would sink or swim. That was the reality no one tells you about. Winning feels like the end of the story, but really, it's the beginning of an even harder one. I learned quickly that the Senate wasn't a victory lap, it was a battlefield. The other senators sized me up the way predators circle new prey. Some smiled politely, already writing me off as a temporary name who'd fade in the next cycle. Others ignored me altogether, and a few tested me, slipping clauses into bills, daring me to notice, waiting to see if I'd flinch. I didn't flinch, because I hadn't clawed my way up from invisibility just to be someone's pawn. Still, the workload was crushing. Policy briefings at dawn, hearings that stretched into the night, endless negotiations where every word mattered. My eyes ached, my voice cracked, my body begged for rest, but I kept going. And in the silence of those long nights, when the building emptied and I sat alone at my desk with only the hum of the lights for company, I reminded myself, this is what they said you couldn't do. This is who they said you'd never be. That kept me steady. But there were enemies I hadn't expected. The lobbyists. They came cloaked in charmed smiles, dinners, whispered offers of support. They tested me with envelopes, promises, shortcuts. The first time, I was tempted. My campaign debt still haunted me, my staff worried about resources, and here were people offering everything I thought I needed. But I remembered Senator Hayes' words. Politics is theater, but behind the curtain is where the real power lies. And I knew, if I took their shortcuts, I'd never hold the pen again. So I said no. That no earned me enemies. Enemies with money, with influence, with power enough to make my nights even longer, and my days even harder. But it also earned me respect from the right people. The quiet ones. The ones who'd been waiting for someone who wouldn't sell out. And slowly, very slowly, my footing grew firmer. The funny thing was, through it all, my family knew nothing. They still thought I was wandering to dinners. When I bothered to attend, they asked me in that same condescending tone, "So, what are you doing now?" And I'd smile and shrug. "Oh, keeping busy." They'd exchange glances, pitying smiles, maybe a sigh about how Daniel was still doing so well under the governor. And Daniel, he loved it. He'd lean back in his chair, recounting stories of state dinners, policy meetings, his close work with the governor. My parents would glow, my relatives would beam, and me, I'd sip my water, nod politely, and let them underestimate me, because I wasn't ready to reveal it yet. Not until the right moment. Not until the stage was set so perfectly that their jaws would hit the floor. But keeping it a secret was harder than I thought. There were slip-ups, like the time a neighbor saw me on the evening news giving a fiery speech on education reform. The next day, my mother called in a panic. "Were you at some kind of meeting on TV?" she asked, her voice sharp. I laughed it off. "Just volunteering again. You know how it is," she sighed. "I wish you'd get serious. Daniel's making such progress. You really should think about stability." I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. Stability. I was sitting in the state senate, drafting laws that would outlast us all. And she was still treating me like a child chasing shadows. But I didn't correct her. Not yet. Because the reveal had to be bigger. It had to be unforgettable. Still, there were moments when the weight nearly broke me. Like the night my first bill was on the floor. I had fought for it tooth and nail, a piece of legislation to expand scholarships for low-income students. The very kind of program that had given me my start. Opposition was fierce. My opponents called it wasteful, irresponsible. I was mocked as the rookie senator with fairy tale dreams. I stood there, heart pounding, my speech trembling in my hands. For a second, I wanted to flee. And then I thought of my father's words. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" I lifted my chin, steadied my voice, and delivered the speech of my life. I spoke about kids who studied by candlelight, about parents who worked 3 jobs, about dreams that burned too bright to be smothered by poverty. The chamber went silent, and when the vote came in, when my bill passed by the thinnest of margins, I nearly collapsed in relief. I had done it, not just for me, for every invisible kid like me. But even that victory, I kept quiet from my family. When I visited home the following weekend, they sat around the table beaming at Daniel. He bragged about introducing the governor at a gala. Everyone clapped. My mother kissed his cheek, and when they turned to me, they asked, "So, still drifting?" I smiled. "Something like that." They laughed. Daniel smirked. And I let them. Because one day soon, their laughter would freeze. And when it did, when the governor himself became the one to reveal me, the silence would be sweeter than any applause. That day was coming, closer than they realized. And every failure they mocked me for would come back to choke them. Not with my words, but with my truth. The truth they had ignored for years. That I was never the failure. I was the fire. The banquet began long before the banquet. What I mean is Daniel couldn't stop talking about it. For weeks, my phone buzzed with group texts from my family, photos of his new suit, messages about how important the event was, reminders that the governor himself would be there. It was like Christmas, but instead of celebrating the season, they were celebrating Daniel. My mother called me one evening, her voice glowing with pride. "Your brother has been asked to sit at the governor's table," she gushed. "Can you believe it? All that hard work is paying off. We're so proud of him." Her tone was honey sweet, but beneath it was the unspoken jab. The comparison, the same old wound, and you. What are you doing with your life? I swallowed hard, smiled into the phone, and said, "That's wonderful." She sighed, the way mothers do when they're disappointed but trying to hide it. "Maybe you'll find something steady too, dear. You can't just float forever." Float, drift, fail, different words, same knife. When I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office, staring at the thick folder of legislation on my desk. The irony nearly made me laugh. Here I was, a sitting senator drafting bills that would impact thousands of lives, and my mother thought I was still floating, but I didn't correct her. I let her believe the lie, because the truth was too powerful to waste on a phone call. The reveal had to happen in person, and fate was kind enough to hand me the perfect stage. It started with a letter. An embossed envelope slid across my desk one morning, its seal heavy and official. I broke it open and scanned the elegant script. "The governor requests the honor of your presence at the annual state leadership banquet." I stared at the invitation, a slow smile spreading across my face. Of course, the very same banquet my brother had been bragging about for weeks. The one he was using as proof that he was the family's shining star. And now, I was going to. Not as his +1. Not as a guest, but as a peer. As a senator. The irony was too delicious. I tucked the envelope away, said nothing to my family, and went about my work as if nothing had changed. But inside, anticipation coiled tight in my chest. The banquet would be the night, the stage, the moment I'd been waiting for since the first time they laughed at me across the dinner table. Still, the weeks leading up to it weren't easy. If Daniel was arrogant before, now he was insufferable. Every conversation at family gatherings circled back to him. He bought a new tuxedo. He practiced his introduction for the governor like it was a Broadway monologue. He even rehearsed handshakes in the mirror, his jaw clenched, his smile plastered on too tight. And my family, they fed it. They clapped, they laughed, they patted him on the back. My father said, "You're destined for great things, son." My mother kissed his cheek and whispered, "You'll make us proud." And when their eyes turned to me, there was only silence, or worse, the pitying sighs. "You should take notes from your brother," my aunt said once. I smiled, bit back every sharp reply that burned my tongue, and said softly, "Maybe I will." Inside, I thought, "You'll all be taking notes from me soon." But I kept my secret, because secrets, when revealed at the perfect moment, are sharper than any blade. Still, there was a part of me that ached, a part that wondered why I still longed for their approval, even after everything, why their laughter still haunted me, even though I'd already proven them wrong 100 times over. I realized something then. Revenge isn't about proving them wrong. It's about reclaiming yourself, and this banquet wasn't just about silencing their voices. It was about silencing the one in my head that still whispered, "You're not enough." The day of the banquet arrived like a storm. Daniel posted photos of himself getting ready. My relatives buzzed in the family chat about how proud they were, how honored they felt by association. Not a single word about me. Perfect. That silence made my secret all the sweeter. I slipped into my gown quietly that night. Not flashy, not screaming for attention. Deep navy silk, elegant and simple, the kind of dress that didn't need to announce itself, it demanded attention by existing. As I fastened the clasp on my necklace, I stared at myself in the mirror. Not the invisible girl they once mocked. Not the failure they laughed at, a senator. And tonight, they'd find out. At the banquet hall, the lights gleamed against marble floors, chandeliers glittered overhead, and servers swept past with silver trays. The air buzzed with power, governors, CEOs, lawmakers, all mingling in polite conversations, smiles sharpened like knives. I walked in alone, my heels clicking against the polished floor. Heads turned, eyes followed, whispers rose and fell, but I didn't falter, because I belonged here. And for the first time, the world knew it. At the far end of the hall, I spotted my family. Daniel stood tall in his tuxedo, his chest puffed out, as he basked in the attention of distant cousins and family friends. My parents hovered near him, their faces glowing with pride, their laughter ringing loud. I felt a strange calm settle over me. They still didn't know, but they would, and the moment was coming faster than they realized, because across the room, the governor had just entered, and his sharp, calculating eyes fell directly on me. He smiled, and in that smile I knew the reveal was seconds away. The banquet hall glittered like a dream, but my heartbeat was steady, calm, almost too calm. It was strange, standing there on the edge of the crowd, watching power shift and settle in the air like smoke. For years, I had been invisible in rooms like this, always the observer, never the honored guest. But tonight was different. I felt it in my bones. The governor's eyes had already found me when he entered. A flicker of recognition, a subtle nod. I lowered mine, pretending not to notice. Timing mattered. Reveals were delicate things, you didn't rush them. Across the room, my brother Daniel was basking in the attention of family friends, his voice carrying loud enough for me to hear. Yes, the governor knows me by name now, he bragged, his smile almost splitting his face. It's only a matter of time before he brings me into his inner circle. My parents clapped him on the back, their laughter ringing like music. That's our son, my father declared proudly, and me. Not a word, not a glance. Perfect. I slipped through the crowd quietly, offering polite smiles, shaking hands when necessary. Colleagues greeted me with respect, their voices warm, their eyes sharp with recognition. Senator, some murmured, bowing their heads, but not loud enough for my family to hear. Not yet. The governor's aide soon tapped a glass and the room shifted into silence. All attention turned toward the raised platform at the center of the hall. The governor stepped forward, his presence commanding. His voice carried with ease, every syllable wrapped in authority. Tonight, he began, we gather not only to celebrate leadership in our state, but to recognize those who have risen with integrity, with perseverance, with vision. Applause broke out. Daniel clapped harder than anyone, his face glowing, convinced every word was about him. The governor continued, leadership is not always recognized early. Sometimes it is doubted, dismissed, even ridiculed. But true leadership cannot be silenced. It rises, even when the world says it will fail. My throat tightened. Was it deliberate, or fate itself echoing my story through his lips? Daniel's grin widened, as if he was drinking in the words. My parents' eyes glistened with pride, and then the governor's gaze swept across the crowd, searching, pausing before landing squarely on me. He lifted his hand, beckoning. Senator, he said, his voice firm, warm, undeniable. Would you join me up here? For a moment, the hall was frozen. Whispers rippled through the room. Heads turned, eyes darted, and in the corner, my family's faces cracked. Confusion, shock, disbelief. Senator, my mother mouthed, her lips trembling. Daniel's smile faltered, slipping like water through his fingers. I took a step forward, The crowd parted around me, a slow hush falling as heels clicked against marble. Every movement felt deliberate, like a scene unfolding exactly as it was meant to. I reached the stage, my gown trailing softly, and the governor extended his hand. I shook it firmly, standing tall as the cameras flashed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming, "please welcome one of the most dedicated public servants in our state. A woman who has defied every obstacle, risen beyond every doubt." Senator, my name echoed through the hall. The applause was thunderous. But in the corner, my family sat frozen. My mother's eyes wide with disbelief. My father's jaw tight. My brother pale, his fists clenched at his sides. I could feel the weight of their silence even as the crowd erupted around me. It was delicious. The governor leaned closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "I had no idea your family didn't know." I smiled softly, eyes fixed on Daniel. "Oh, they know now." And when I turned, letting my gaze sweep the room, I met my brother's stare. The proud, arrogant boy who had mocked me, belittled me, painted himself as the chosen one, was now nothing more than a shadow in the corner. I held his gaze as I lifted the glass in my hand. "To perseverance," I said, my voice calm, steady, resonant. The hall roared with cheers. But Daniel, he looked like a man who'd just watched his crown shatter at his feet. And I felt a peace I hadn't known in years, because the truth had finally, undeniably, silenced every lie they had spoken about me, and the night was only just beginning. The applause still rang in my ears, but I barely heard it. What I felt most was the silence from the one corner of the room that mattered. My family's corner. Every cheer, every handshake, every congratulatory smile only magnified their disbelief. When the governor released my hand and the crowd shifted back into lively chatter, I slipped off the stage gracefully, weaving back through the guests. People leaned in to speak to me, their voices warm. "Senator, your work on education reform was inspiring. Your healthcare initiative brilliant. You're a role model, truly." I smiled politely, offering thanks, but my eyes were sharp, scanning, and then I saw them. My father's glass remained untouched on the table, his knuckles white as he gripped it. My mother's lips were pressed so tightly they had lost their color. And Daniel sat stiffly, his smile forced, his jaw ticking with suppressed rage. I approached slowly, savoring the tension that rolled off them in waves. "Well," I said lightly, setting my glass down, "I suppose this answers your question about what I've been doing all these years." My father finally spoke, his voice low, dangerous. "Why didn't you tell us?" I tilted my head, letting my eyes sparkle with the faintest trace of amusement. "You never asked." My mother's voice cracked. We thought you failed, and you were so quick to believe that." I replied softly, "Because it was easier to believe the worst of me than to imagine I might succeed without you." Daniel finally snapped. His voice was louder than he intended, drawing curious glances from nearby tables. "You tricked us," he spat. "You made us look like fools tonight." I leaned closer, lowering my voice just enough to make him strain to hear. "No, Daniel, you did that to yourself. Every word you spoke about me being worthless, every time you dismissed me in front of them, you carved your own reflection tonight." I simply let the mirror face the crowd, his face flushed red, his fists clenching at his sides. Guests nearby began whispering, pretending to sip their wine while hanging onto every word. I caught snippets. Her own family didn't know. The brother must be livid. What a humiliation. The whispers stung Daniel more than my words ever could. His pride, The one thing he guarded more fiercely than his own breath was crumbling in public. My father leaned in, his voice hushed but sharp. This deception is shameful. I met his glare evenly. Shameful or inconvenient for the narrative you built about me? Tell me, father, which wounds you more? That I succeeded, or that I didn't need your approval to do it? The silence that followed was delicious. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a screech that made heads turn. Enjoy it while it lasts, he hissed. You may be senator now, but you'll never be part of this family again. I held his stare, my voice calm. Daniel, you made sure of that years ago. The difference is tonight, I don't need this family anymore. And that terrifies you, doesn't it? His jaw tightened. He turned and stormed out, his footsteps echoing across the marble. My mother called after him, her voice trembling. But he didn't look back. The hall seemed to buzz louder after his exit, curiosity thick in the air. My father sat rigid, his anger boiling but contained. For he knew just as I did that in this room, in this moment, his power meant nothing, because tonight, all eyes were on me, and I had never stood taller. The banquet resumed, but something had shifted. Music still played softly, the servers still poured wine. The governor still mingled with dignitaries, yet an undercurrent of whispers now threaded through every corner of the hall. I didn't need to strain to hear them. They didn't know she was senator. The brother's reaction unbelievable. Imagine dismissing her all these years. Each murmured word sliced deeper into my family's pride. My father, who once commanded respect in every room he entered, now sat in silence, his shoulders stiff, his eyes glued to his untouched plate. His authority, the thing he clung to most, was dissolving in front of the very people he wished to impress. My mother's trembling hand fumbled with her necklace, her face pale, eyes darting nervously whenever someone looked her way. She was a woman unraveling, not because of my success, but because the illusion of control had shattered. And Daniel, oh Daniel, he hadn't returned. His dramatic exit was all anyone remembered now, and every whisper of his name carried the sting of ridicule. I sipped my wine slowly, savoring the taste not of the drink, but of poetic justice. For years, I had imagined what this moment would feel like. I thought I'd want to shout, to throw their cruelty back at them with venom. But now I realized revenge didn't need fire. Sometimes, silence and dignity were far sharper blades. The governor approached me again, a genial smile on his face. Senator, he said warmly, you must forgive me. I had no idea you were connected to Daniel's family. I laughed softly, controlled. Neither did they. The governor chuckled, but his eyes were sharp, discerning. He had seen it all, the tension, the humiliation, the unraveling. And he understood, without me needing to explain, the years of dismissal that had led to this moment. He lowered his voice just enough for only me to hear. Success is the sweetest silence, isn't it? I held his gaze, my lips curving into a faint smile. It is. Around us, conversations picked up again, but now the tone was different. People gravitated toward me, eager to connect, eager to be seen speaking to me. One councilman's wife leaned in conspiratorially. My dear, you handled that with such grace. Many would have shouted. You let the truth do the work. I thanked her, though inside, I marveled at the irony. Grace, they called it. But I knew what it really was. Years of pain hardened into steel, tempered into silence. I caught sight of my mother rising unsteadily from the table, her eyes glossy, her dignity fraying. She excused herself quickly, muttering something about the powder room, though everyone knew it was an escape. My father remained seated, rigid and red-faced, the weight of 100 unseen eyes pressing on him. For a man who built his identity on authority, tonight was nothing short of ruin, and me. I stood in the center of it all, calm, unshaken, my presence unmovable. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow. I wasn't the forgotten one. I wasn't the disappointment. I was the storm, and they were standing in the wreckage of their own arrogance. Still, as I looked around at the opulence, the glittering chandeliers, the murmuring elite, a strange pang tugged at my chest. This wasn't the joy I had imagined. This wasn't the laughter of sweet revenge. It was quieter, heavier, a solemn victory, because the truth is no amount of success could erase the years of wounds. But it did something else. It reminded me that I had never needed their approval to begin with, and perhaps that was the deepest revenge of all. The banquet eventually ended, as all grand evenings do. The music faded, the lights dimmed, and the last of the laughter drifted into the night, but some echoes don't die so quietly. The very next morning, whispers had already left the governor's mansion and seeped into the city's political circles. I didn't have to seek them out, they found me, carried on the lips of colleagues, staffers, even reporters sniffing around for gossip. Daniel's name was suddenly tangled with mine in every conversation. But not in the way he would have wanted. They say he stormed out of the governor's banquet. Apparently, he had no idea his sister was a sitting senator. Unbelievable. Imagine underestimating your own blood like that. By midweek, Daniel's office had become a fortress, reporters camping outside, his staff scrambling with tight smiles and firm no comments. His image, polished, proud, untouchable, was cracking, and the public loves nothing more than a crack in power. I didn't gloat, not outwardly. But when I read the headlines, governor's aide humiliated at banquet after outburst at senator sister, I felt something deep and satisfying twist inside me. For years, Daniel had been the golden son, the pride, the chosen one. Every achievement of his was celebrated as if it reflected the family's superiority. Now, his name was a punchline, and my name was power, respect, authority. My father called me 2 days later. His voice was low, unfamiliar, almost pleading. "You must fix this," he said, without preamble. "Fix what?" I asked, my tone calm, though my pulse quickened. "This mess," he growled. "The family name, Daniel's career. They're dragging us through the mud." I let the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable. "You mean," I said softly, "that you are finally facing what I lived with for years? Shame, ridicule, dismissal. Only difference is, father, mine was in private. Yours is very, very public." He inhaled sharply, as if my words struck deeper than he'd expected. "You think this is victory?" He spat. "No," I replied evenly. "This is justice." He hung up without another word. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar ache after one of his calls. No lingering craving for approval, just clarity. Daniel's downfall wasn't my doing, not directly. He dug his own grave with arrogance, with blind certainty that I would always remain beneath him. All I did was rise, and in doing so I cast a shadow that revealed the cracks he'd hidden for so long. But even as the news swelled, as people's eyes sparkled with gossip, as Daniel's silence grew heavier by the day, I found myself restless. The banquet had been one night. His humiliation, though public, was fleeting. I began to wonder, was this enough? Or was the universe merely giving me the first taste of what was still to come? Because one thing had become clear: power changes the game. And for the first time, I had it. Not just the title of senator, but the ability to reshape the story. And Daniel's story was only beginning to unravel. The weeks after the banquet passed in a blur of strategy and subtle influence. I didn't gloat. I didn't stage a spectacle. That kind of theater is for amateurs. Real power is quiet, patient, calculated. Daniel, on the other hand, had become a storm of flustered calls, awkward meetings, and whispered apologies to political colleagues. I watched from the sidelines, not with cruelty, but with precision. It began with small things. A scheduling conflict that left him missing an important briefing. A policy proposal quietly delayed because I was the liaison between the governor's office and his department. Each move invisible, each ripple felt only by those who understood the machinery of politics. And it worked. Daniel grew frantic. His emails became terse, his phone calls jittery, his usually confident speeches laced with uncertainty. My parents noticed the tension but misread it entirely, assuming he had finally outgrown the banquet embarrassment. I smiled quietly, savoring the irony, but with each small victory came reflection. Revenge, I realized, was a strange taste. Sweet, yes, but not intoxicating in the way I had imagined. It was cleaner, sharper, a quiet justice rather than a roaring fire. I began to write legislation with renewed vigor. Each bill I passed, each initiative I led, was another testament to the life I had built on my own terms. And every success reminded me that Daniel's missteps were his own doing, amplified only by his arrogance. At home, the tension was palpable. Daniel avoided eye contact. My parents' pride in him had faltered, replaced by silent worry. The social calls that once celebrated his achievements now carried a hushed, questioning tone, and all the while, I remained outwardly calm, polite at family dinners, smiling when my mother asked, "So, anything new at work?" "Yes," I said, just enough to intrigue, but not reveal. "Things are moving." She nodded vaguely, satisfied, or at least thinking she was. I understood then that real power isn't always about dramatic reveals or public humiliation. Sometimes it's about control over perception, quietly influencing events, letting the truth speak louder than words ever could. Daniel's panic grew with every small ripple I created. He called friends, mentors, even political allies, desperate for guidance, desperate for reassurance. And every time, the answer came back the same: you underestimated her. You ignored her. And now you're learning why that was a mistake. It was poetic. But even as I orchestrated these subtle shifts, I found myself reflecting on my own journey. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the isolation, it all led to this moment. The irony was unmistakable. The family that once dismissed me as a failure now depended on my indirect mercy. And yet, there was no satisfaction in cruelty, only in truth, only in reclaiming my own narrative. By the end of the month, Daniel was a man fraying at the edges. Meetings that once boosted his confidence now left him second-guessing every word. His reputation, once built on charm and assumed competence, wavered under the quiet, unstoppable pressure of my success. I didn't need to confront him. He had confronted himself, and in that quiet victory, I felt something I had never truly felt before: freedom. Because revenge, as I had come to understand, isn't about punishment. It's about claiming your place, and I had done that. Daniel never learns gracefully. He never accepts that the world has shifted and that the rules he once relied upon no longer apply. Weeks after the banquet, whispers reached me that he was planning a political maneuver, something ambitious, reckless, and obviously desperate. A proposal designed to outshine me, to reclaim the spotlight he had lost. I watched silently, letting him build his fragile castle of ambition. He rallied a few allies, promising them influence, swearing loyalty. He spoke in confident tones, though those closest to him noticed the tremor in his hands, the flicker of doubt behind his eyes, and I smiled quietly, savoring the precision of timing, because I already knew the outcome. I had spent years understanding the subtleties of perception, the invisible threads that connect influence and outcome. I had anticipated his moves, calculated their consequences, and ensured that every attempt to reclaim control would crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. When he called me ostensibly to discuss collaboration, I let him speak. I smiled, nodded, and occasionally interjected just enough to appear engaged. All the while, I held the power. The first misstep came when one of his allies, a man who had long been friendly with both of us, called me privately, "Your brothers." Pushing a risky initiative, he warned. If it fails, it'll be all over for him. He doesn't realize how fragile his position is. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I traced a finger along the edge of my desk and whispered under my breath, "Fragile is beautiful." The second misstep was his overconfidence. He underestimated the governor's recognition of me, the subtle alliances I had cultivated behind the scenes, the respect I had quietly earned. He presented his plan at a closed meeting, expecting applause, expecting support. Instead, the room sat quietly, their expressions polite but cold. By the time he realized he was alone, the damage was done. Every attempt to pivot, to explain, to salvage credibility, only made the outcome worse. The whispers had already begun. Overestimated himself, underestimated the senator, reckless ambition. I had done nothing except be prepared. Later that evening, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the day's events, sipping tea, feeling the strange satisfaction of watching inevitability unfold. Daniel's desperation was self-inflicted. Every misstep, every miscalculation, every impulsive word, all fueled by his own arrogance, all perfectly timed to my advantage. It was then I realized the final truth about power. It doesn't demand spectacle. It doesn't demand rage. It simply waits, patient, precise, unseen until the moment it is undeniable. And I finally, fully understood it, because Daniel's countermove wasn't a threat. It was proof that I had become untouchable in ways they had never imagined. And it was only the beginning. The governor had called me for a private meeting the next day, something about strategy and long-term initiatives. I knew it wasn't just routine. I felt it in the subtle lift of his eyes, the calculated calm in his tone. The moment for the final revelation was approaching, and when it came, it would be complete. The governor's office was calm, almost deceptively serene. The marble floors reflected the afternoon light, the weight of power quiet and unspoken in every polished surface. I entered, greeting him with a firm handshake and a smile that was all professional composure. He gestured to a seat across from his massive oak desk. "Senator," he began, his tone smooth, measured, deliberate, "congratulations again on your recent victories. Your work is exceptional." I inclined my head, modest but aware. "Thank you, Governor. Your guidance has been invaluable." He smiled, leaning back slightly. "I didn't realize just how much you'd accomplished until the banquet. I must admit, your family clearly underestimated you." I allowed a faint Polite smile. They always have. The governor's gaze sharpened, as if measuring my resolve. It's rare, he said slowly, to see someone rise so quickly, with such impact, and without the usual backing, the usual pedigree. You've earned every bit of your success and more. You're shaping policy, influencing decisions, and gaining respect from all corners of the state. The fact that your brother is still floundering, well, that speaks volumes. I nodded, letting his words sink in. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice dropping so only I could hear. And there will be more opportunities. Public recognition, higher committees, influence you've only just begun to grasp. But timing is everything. Your family, your brother, let them witness the rise without realizing the steps you've taken. It makes the impact sharper, unforgettable. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. I've learned the power of patience, he chuckled softly. Good, because the final stage is coming. The public acknowledgement, the one that will cement your position and make your achievements undeniable, even to those closest to you. I leaned back, considering his words. I had planned my moves carefully, calculated every ripple, anticipated every reaction. But his support, quiet, strategic, unwavering, added weight to my position I hadn't fully expected. The banquet was just the beginning, he continued. The world is watching now, and soon, Daniel and your family will see the full extent of your accomplishments. They'll understand, in no uncertain terms, that you were never the one to underestimate. I nodded again, feeling the subtle thrill of inevitability. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was about truth, about visibility, about claiming what was always mine. The governor rose, walking to the window, hands clasped behind him. The next public event, he said, turning slightly, will be perfect. You will be recognized officially, in front of everyone. And your family, well, they will finally have no choice but to acknowledge your success. I allowed a slow, calm breath. I look forward to it, and in that moment, I understood the full scope of power. It wasn't just the titles, the influence, the committees. It was the precision, the timing, the quiet control of perception. I had been underestimated my whole life, ignored, belittled, dismissed, but not anymore. And soon, the entire world, including the people who had once claimed to know me best, would see exactly who I had become. The room was buzzing with anticipation. Reporters, politicians, and dignitaries filled the hall, their eyes bright with curiosity. Cameras clicked. The air smelled of polished floors, faint perfume, and the electricity of expectation. I stood at the side of the room, composed, calm, my gown flowing softly with each step. The governor's presence beside me gave subtle weight to my posture. He had arranged everything, the timing, the spotlight, the perfect moment for everyone, especially my family, to witness what they had long denied. Daniel was already there, chest puffed, trying to look confident, waving to colleagues as if his earlier humiliation could be rewritten with charm. My parents sat nearby, eyes darting nervously, unaware that the night would belong to me. The governor stepped to the podium, clearing his throat. The room fell silent immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice commanding, smooth, deliberate. Tonight, we honor leadership, dedication, and achievement. And sometimes, the most extraordinary leaders emerge from places we least expect. I felt the hush deepen as his gaze swept across the crowd, pausing for effect. Then, slowly, he turned to me. Senator, full name, who has already made tremendous contributions to our state's education and policy initiatives, has achieved remarkable success, often quietly, often against expectations. She is here tonight, not only to be celebrated, but to serve as an example of perseverance and excellence. The applause was immediate and thunderous. Cameras flashed. Conversations halted mid-word. People turned to witness the woman who had been whispered about behind closed doors now standing at the forefront of power. And then Daniel's reaction. He froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The confidence he had worn, like armor, was gone, replaced by disbelief. My parents clutched their hands together, their expressions a mixture of awe, shock, and regret. I stepped forward gracefully, shaking the governor's hand as he presented me formally. Senator Full name, ladies and gentlemen, he said. A leader who has earned her place, not by inheritance or favoritism, but by intelligence, resilience, and unwavering commitment. The applause swelled again. I allowed myself a small smile, scanning the room until my eyes settled on my family. My mother's eyes glistened with tears. My father's jaw was tight, the weight of recognition heavy on him. And Daniel looked like a man who had just watched everything he believed crumble in an instant. I raised my glass subtly, letting the movement be seen but not overdone. To perseverance, I said, quietly but firmly. The room followed my lead, raising their glasses in unison. Every whispered conversation about Daniel's arrogance, every conversation that questioned my abilities, every doubt my family had nurtured, it all fell away in that single, undeniable moment. The truth had arrived, and it was unstoppable. Daniel muttered something under his breath, the words lost in the clamor of recognition. He had no recovery. He could not spin this. He could only watch as the world finally saw what I had always known about myself. I was not a failure. I was not invisible. I was not beneath anyone. I felt a strange calm wash over me, deeper than the thrill of revenge. This was satisfaction. Yes, but it was also liberation. The long years of dismissal, doubt, and underestimation were gone, replaced by authority and acknowledgement that no one could deny. And as I stood there, the applause ringing in the kind of heavy, reflective silence that follows a storm, Daniel didn't speak. Not to me, not to anyone. His presence was still there, but diminished, like a shadow fading at dusk. My parents avoided confrontation. They didn't know whether to be proud or chastised. Their pride was tangled with the sting of having misjudged me for so long, and I watched them all with gentle calm. I realized that the revenge I had imagined for years, dramatic, theatrical, scorching, had never truly been about them. It had been about reclaiming myself. I had been underestimated, dismissed, ignored. I had been told I was a failure, a disappointment, a shadow, and now, in the quiet aftermath, I understood something vital. None of that mattered. I was senator. I was capable. I was recognized. And I had done it on my own terms. Daniel's attempts to regain control had failed spectacularly. His reputation had suffered, his confidence shaken, and the world had seen the truth. I was not beneath him, nor anyone else. My parents, slowly, began to adjust. Their conversations became less critical, more tentative. I could see the awareness settling in their eyes that they had underestimated me, and that they would need to respect my position moving forward. I allowed myself a small, private smile. It wasn't triumph over them. It was acknowledgement of reality. And as for Daniel, he eventually stopped trying. He retreated into the spaces he knew, avoided public appearances, and learned to lay the cost of arrogance and underestimation. I watched him once, from a distance and felt no malice, only understanding. The boy who had mocked me was gone. The man who remained was someone learning the hard way what I had learned quietly over the years, that true power isn't taken. It is earned, patiently, steadily, without spectacle. I poured myself a cup of tea that evening, settling into my office with the city lights twinkling outside the window. For years, I had waited for acknowledgement, for respect, for the validation that comes from seeing others recognize your worth. But now, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't their recognition at all. It was my own. The power to stand tall, to speak with authority, to move through the world knowing my value without question. That was freedom, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, unshakably free. I lifted my cup in a quiet toast to perseverance, to truth, to reclaiming what was always mine. And in that stillness I knew this story, my story, was only just beginning.